나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교. Hello, everyone. How are you today? I hope this finds you in good health and secure. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. I thought, I don't know how much I will read from this book, but it was quite an interesting read and speaks to, well, a great many teachings of Buddhism. Not a lot on the Lotus Sutra, unfortunately, but it is mentioned, and that's because this is a book made by, in service to the, there's the Lotus Sutra, 7374. What does it say about that? The archaeological finds of just the last 20 years or so of the Gandhara region, as I've spoken about it a few times, as the northeastern portion of what used to be India is now part India, part Pakistan, part other nations, and really, really interesting finds in, and you've heard me talk about this before, besides such errors revealing an underlying Gandhari pronunciation, there are also several cases of copying errors indicating that the Indian archetype texts were written in Kharoshthi script and therefore presumably in Gandhari rather than in Sanskrit and Brahmi. For example, another Lotus Sutra passage is addressed in its Sanskrit version to Ajita, which is the personal name of the future Buddha Maitreya. But this word is rendered in Dharmaraksa's Chinese with the word for the number 80. This makes absolutely no sense if one assumes that the Chinese version was translated from Sanskrit, but in Gandhari, the equivalent of the Sanskrit name Ajita is Ayida, while the word for 80 is Asidi, or Sanskrit Asiti. Now, in many styles of Kharoshthi script, the letter for Y and Esh are very similar, sometimes even identical. Thus, the translator or some previous scribe must have misread or miscopied Ayida as Ashida and then interpreted as the word for 80. The only reasonable conclusion in such a case is that the Chinese translation was based directly or indirectly on an archetype in Kharoshthi and Gandhari, where the two words concerned could look identical. Whereas in Sanskrit, the Brahmi, they would have had no such similarity. So that's just a quick little excerpt about what this book deals with. This is written by one of the, or more than one, who's credited? Solomon, of the researchers of this northern and eastern India territory, which was seen as kind of an intellectual center during the transition of Buddhism from India to China and other countries, into Europe, even in the Middle East, and into certainly into China. It's a very interesting site, as if you read this book, you will find that there is a great deal of translation work going on in this area to various scripts, from various scripts. And the reason this was unearthed, quite literally, was that, as I've mentioned in other videos, often these transcriptions from either verbal or earlier transmissions in other scripts were scribed and kept in clay jars, which were then buried by the people paying for these translations in order to secure the long history of Buddhist teachings into the future. As I've mentioned before, there is a kind of neuroses that starts with Shakyamuni himself about, this verbally transmitted, memorized and repeated teaching, these sermons, that they would diminish over time. Their spread, their propagation would diminish, and then there would be no record of them. And this was fine with Shakyamuni in that he really believed that whoever was discussing these teachings of his would have to do so in their own native tongue, their own native culture, their own native way of seeing the world, life, so on and so forth. Because without that, Buddhism would die out as something foreign and bizarre and mystical, and he didn't want that. He wanted people to be able to speak plainly about enlightenment, that enlightenment was something that everyone was capable of, no matter what their station or culture or language. So it was his intent that by spreading the teachings verbally, they would mutate in language form, but with the same meaning throughout the different cultures the teachings would encounter. And Gandhara is an amazing architectural find of the modern era. Architectural. Oh my gosh, I can't even think of the word now. Anyway, paleontologist, archaeologist, thank you. Because at this late date, so many thousands of years after the Buddha's passing, Shakyamuni's passing, to find all of this wealth of translations, some in museums, some in private collections, some right out of the ground, it's kind of a revelation. Most of what was translated in that area is transitional from pre-20th century and into the 20th century. Several hundred years after Shakyamuni's passing. So there are early texts. There are a lot of Hinayana texts in there. There's a lot of, they talk about how this fallacy that some Hinayana groups have. What do you do? Anyway, as little dogs will do. All dogs. Anyway. So this is a fascinating read if you're interested in some of what I'm constantly referring to, the translation biases and the difficulty of none of us know the exact words spoken by Shakyamuni. Those that would claim they know the exact words, big doses of salt, yeah? Like there are some sects, as I was going to say, who think that the Pali language canon is the actual words of Shakyamuni. Well, obviously not, because Shakyamuni spoke in Prakrit. So, it's the nature of organizations, isn't it? That organizations, their first duty is to strengthening the value of their organization, period. Members and students, they're all down the list somewhere, which is not what I want this Sangha to be. This Sangha is about you and me and our practice of Shakyamuni's teachings of the Lotus Sutra. But by studying all of this history and the transmission and so forth, there's a certain amount of, if you're like me, it instills a certain amount of confidence in knowing that our understanding, our pulling out of the meaning, the aha moments that we get, right? The insights that we get, they're completely valid. They are more true to the transmission of Shakyamuni's teachings than the words, right? And Shakyamuni tells us this constantly throughout the sutras. So this is very, I don't know, not everybody will be as fascinated or entertained by this kind of knowledge. But for those of us who are, this is really a wonderful book, as it is another book I've mentioned before, the Lotus Sutra, or not the Lotus Sutra, what's it called? I think it's just called Sutras. And it talks about the journey from India through the Himalayas, back and forth between China and India, and a really fascinating account of just what the monks had to go through in those early years of the developments of Buddhism into the Chinese continent, or part of the continent anyway. It just rounds out our experience of Buddhism and the preciousness of the meaning, so driven throughout thousands of years of cultures. Yeah. So anyway, to me, it's a very big confidence builder. I wanted to read, because we just finished reading the Lankavatara and the Diamond Sutra. There is a section, you can see it's late in the book, it's in section 12, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And I just wanted to read a little bit of their scholarship, talking about the transmission of these teachings, which I find, again, as fascinating as it is gratifying, and supports our practice, in that there's a lot of very smart people out there who are chasing this down along with our practice, and it keeps coming up, you know, very earthbound, very much a study for our experience of Buddhahood. Because you can't study Buddhahood, you can't study an experience, you can only experience it. So everything else comes to us via fingers pointing, right? To be the moon is to experience moonness, or Buddha-ness in our case, right? So the Perfection of Wisdom school starts out, the many sutras grouped under the category Perfection of Wisdom, or Prajnaparamita, constitute one of the most influential bodies of the literature in Buddhism. No doubt, because it's much closer to that huge translation effort made in the timeline, right, to spread to other countries. The various Perfection of Wisdom sutras are extant in a vast variety of forms and versions, in Sanskrit and in Chinese and Tibetan translations, and are still central to the belief system and practice of Buddhism in much of East Asia. Excuse me. The Perfection of Wisdom literature lies at the heart of Mahayana Buddhism and is usually thought of as constituting the earliest manifestations of Mahayana, or more strictly speaking, of the several streams of thought that eventually coalesced into the classical Mahayana. The primacy of the Perfection of Wisdom doctrine and texts is strongly supported by the newly discovered Gandhari material. Like Mahayana texts in general, the Perfection of Wisdom sutras are esoteric literature, not in the casual or colloquial sense of obscure or mysterious, but in the proper etymological sense of the term. Esoteric, from the Greek esoteros, meaning interior, or deeper within, denotes teachings that are presented or restricted to a particular limited audience and hence are to some degree hidden or secret. For Mahayana sutras are understood by their followers to represent teachings of the Buddha that are not addressed to the general lay and monastic public like the mainstream sutras preserved by the Pali Canon, but rather were reserved for select disciples, divine beings, and sometimes also lay followers whose level of spiritual awareness enabled them to comprehend these deeper teachings. Not surprisingly, as with esoteric teachings these writers are archaeologists first, they're not Buddhists. So they refer to Buddhism as a religion, which you and I know it isn't. But in that umbrella term, these texts were rejected as later-day forgeries by the followers of the traditional conservative doctrines and canons who predominate in modern Buddhism as adherents of the Theravada school in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, the Hinayanists. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear beyond the colorful teachings of the earlier teachings of Buddhism, this intellectual digging into the nature of enlightenment. They don't want to hear that. To this day, they still don't want to hear that. There have been some exceptions. Thich Nhat Hanh was one Theravadist who was more inclusive of the Mahayana, but still didn't quite go that final moment of realization. Unfortunate. Was a great teacher, but fell short of the mark. No insult to him or his work or any of you for following him. There's a lot, as we do here, a lot of scholarship, right, that was discussed, and that's all part of our understanding, ultimately, of the Lotus Sutra, self-realization, self-enlightenment. But those who accepted the new revelations looked down upon the old ways of the lower, though not false, path, which they referred to as Hinayana, that is, the inferior or abandoned vehicle. That's probably a modern quirk, but truly Hinayana just means lesser, the early teachings. I'm not trying to bash them, I'm just saying it's incomplete, right? Which in their view had been superseded by the new and superior Mahayana, or great vehicle. That's accurate. Adherents of Mahayana Buddhism now prevail throughout Tibet and most of Eastern Asia, including China, Korea, and Japan. The perfection of wisdom literature can also be characterized as... He just finished... we're dealing with Edward Conze. There's that name. A pioneering scholar of the perfection of wisdom school, considered its essence to lie in the series of paradoxes which he summarized in 2 sentences. One should become a bodhisattva, i.e., one who is content with nothing less than all knowledge attained through perfection of wisdom for the sake of all living beings, and there is no such thing as a bodhisattva, or as all knowledge, or as being, or as the perfection of wisdom, or as an attainment. Practitioners of the perfection of wisdom, however, might prefer to think of these statements as only apparent paradoxes, as explained by Paul Williams. By switching between the 2 levels, ultimate and conventional, it is possible to generate apparent paradoxes for pedagogic effect, but there are no genuine paradoxes, no real speaking in contradictions in the perfection of wisdom. And we've dealt with that quite a lot, right? And then it talks about certain characters such as Shariputra, Subhuti, and the Buddha, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, in Gandhari. Anyway, this is more of, you could say, an academic study. But I think it has value in that, although every single word isn't perfect or correct. As we are students of Buddhism, The more that we study about the history of its migrations through different cultures, the more insight we get. And I think overall it helps us to understand how when we read a book by Red Pine or the Gosho, Nichiren's Gosho, we have to be conscious that what's important is not the words themselves as valuable or what you might say the indelible teachings or the words of Nichiren for that matter, but that in their entirety, in every Gosho, in every series of Gosho, we can see the different voices of Nichiren. We've discussed that in the over 500 videos on this channel, from different schools of translation of the Gosho, right? We've read different translations from the what is it called? It's a long name. The propagation, of International Propagation Bureau of whatever the hell it is, that has their translations of the Gosho that they have access to versus the international print and scholarship via, I don't want to give NST so much credit for it, but there's a whole other school of Nichiren that have a huge compendium of Gosho collections, private collections, as well as authoritative and temple collections. So it's interesting because between the two largest translators of Nichiren's words, there are discrepancies in interpretations and certainly in the rhetoric, right? The words. One still hung up on the idea of a soul, which never ends to confound me, because this is one of the and we've been reading it over and over and over again. Shakyamuni is like stamping this idiocy out, that there's some kind of eternal self or ego. My goodness, Buddhism is all about losing that illusion. And yet, here are schools of translations reinserting the language of soul into Nichiren's words. It's insane that they would do that. Not so much the other school, but they have their own twists of phrase in order to appeal to, and this is organizations, appeal to those Westerners who need to learn Buddhism. So let's use some of their terms so this will sound more friendly, and they adopt it into the rhetoric of Buddhism. Has no business being in there. Anyway, I've talked about that ad nauseum, but you know, pointing out scholarship like this book about Gandhara, that's recent decades of discovery, again validates that we learn the meaning of all of these translations, that when we chant Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, we are invoking the very compendium of teachings that is the Threefold Lotus Sutra. Remember, Myoho Renge Kyo is the title of that teaching, and every chapter of that teaching. The point is the umbrella encapsulation of those concepts, that is self-enlightenment. The Lotus Sutra, spoken by Shakyamuni as the way he himself attained enlightenment. This is yours to do now. And so whatever you need to study, whatever you need to gain your confidence, and know that when you invoke your Buddha-ness, which we do with the perfect mirror, right? The encapsulations of Myoho Renge Kyo in characters on a scroll, just to focus our earthly mind, our samsaric mind, so that we can get rid of the distractions and focus in on our internal portal, Gohanzon, to experience Buddha-ness, right? If you can do it with all of that, terrific. Not so easy, is it, to forget stuff, right? But once you achieve it, once you attain Buddha-ness, you know it, you feel it, you sense it. It's in your experience. And that's where Buddha-ness is, right? Carrying that experience then back into our samsaric existence is our bodhisattva life. So that's kind of a short video, but I said everything I needed to say. I still haven't picked out another sutra. I did want to point out this book. I just happened to see it in my library last night, and I thought I should say something about it so that you know that, first of all, I want you to be confident that what I speak of and what I've learned over 40 years of practice isn't just coming out of my butt. I'm speaking to you in person-to-person language about this, all of this scholarship that I've read and studied, and it's opened my mind, and hopefully by sharing those insights with you, you can garner your own insights, right? We don't want to make it up as we go, but we want it to be personal. That's what enlightenment is. Shakyamuni's been saying this from the get-go. Why do you think he came up with those the Eightfold Noble Path, right? If you study the Eightfold Noble Path, which is a method of behavior to instantiate the realization of the Four Noble Truths. How do we cease the formations? How do we quiet the monkey mind so that we can experience Buddha-ness? Well, here are 8 ways of living that will lead you toward that. Right? Earliest teachings of Shakyamuni. But those were all teachings directed to others to get, look, if you do this, you'll understand. You'll gain insight. Until the final 8 years of his life, he taught the Lotus Sutra. Because by the time he got to that stage of teaching, he said, look, you all know and understand and have the capacity to understand everything I've taught for these over 40 years. Now focus on this. This is the way I did it. You can do it. Anyone can do it. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo, or Myoho Renge Kyo. This is it. And then in his deathbed, he spoke the Parinirvana Sutra, speak, which was really an entire appeasing the laments of everyone. Oh my God, he's dying. How are we going to exist? How are we going to... No. Just do what I've been telling you. Practice what you now know. Referring to the Lotus Sutra. Answering these laments of him leaving, the last compassionate act before he was extinguished, right? Extinct. I've taught you everything. Keep going with what you know now, the Lotus Sutra. Keep doing that. You can do that. It is your practice to do. It isn't something I can give you. Right? We talk about this all the time. I can't give you Buddhism or Buddha-ness. You have to achieve Buddha-ness because Buddha-ness is for you to extrapolate from your samsaric experience. Only you know what that is. So your insights are your insights. You can share them, and they may spawn other insights in other people. That's bodhisattva work. Right? Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It grows our Sangha. For those of you who are supporting this channel financially or with donations of any sort, patrons, you guys are incredible and valuable to this practice, to the propagation of Nichiren's doctrine of Shakyamuni's Lotus Sutra. Yeah? And maybe we'll go back to the Lotus Sutra. I've got a lot of videos about it, but please let me know in the comments. What do you think? Should I investigate? Maybe look Maybe you want to hear more from the Gandhari side of things, some history. Let me know. It's important to me that I'm still providing a voice, insights, scholarship that's helpful to your practice. That's the whole reason for this resource. Okay? Take care of your health. Be kind to yourself. Keep your practice strong. And I'll see you in the next one. Okay? Bye for now.